Hello and welcome to a moment with Vivacious. I want y'all to know I am not quiet through this war thing. I wanted to listen. And the first thing I wanted to do about the war, I wanted to come out and talk about where we should be and how we should be thinking and how can we win. Not America, we the people of the United States. And a very intelligent, good friend of mine who is running for office right now, being a part of the solution, Astrid Ross, is coming on tonight, and we're going to talk about how we should be thinking and what we should be doing as American people. So look, call all your friends. I sent out a big announcement for tonight because we need to hear this and we need to be a part of it. So while we're doing the intro, I want you guys to call somebody. And look, who's ever on right now, I need you to like and make comments, okay? See you in a moment. Welcome to A Moment with Vivacious, a freedom ride where we the people gather to build ourselves, our family, our community, and our nation. For the sound of America for Progress has reached critical mass. Understanding that we must put aside our differences to focus on the greater good. This is a place of collaboration to rebuild and restore our nation. Welcome to A Moment with Vivacious. Hello, and we want to welcome our guest tonight, Miss Astrid Ross. Hello, how are you?
Hi, how are you, Miss Val? Good, good.
I am excited. I am excited about tonight because the one thing I'm tired of, I don't want to, even though I sit down and watch what's going on all the time, I don't want to keep talking about it. We know that what's going on is horrible. We know the state of politics today. And you just were an answer to my prayer when you called and said, I'm available. We got to do this. And you're right, we have to do this. So first of all, I would like you to introduce yourself to our guest. Talk about some things. Talk about where you're running, what you're running for, and why you're doing it. Just give us some seed for thought, because we have to grow our minds real fast.
No problem. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Astrid Ross. I am first and foremost a mother. I have 5 adult children and 2 grandbabies, which my oldest grandbaby has a birthday here this week. So shout out to Eliana. Happy birthday, Eliana. I have an 11-year-old and a 3-year-old grandson. So as a mother and a grandmother, in my career, I served 30 years in early childhood education. I currently serve as the principal of a private Montessori accredited school in Lilburn, Georgia, City of Knowledge. I've been there for 22 years serving our community. I also am the executive director of the Mental Health Support Network. This labor of love for our was founded by myself and my children in 2020. I'm a suicide loss survivor. My dad was a Vietnam vet that took his own life when I was a baby. And typically, like in the Black community, we don't have the resources or even the knowledge of how to handle such trauma. So what we did is we buried the trauma. And I didn't address that until I first learned about it when I was in my 20s, and really didn't do anything until we realized the direction that our children's career paths after graduating high school were going. And I sat my children down in 2020. At that point, we had my oldest daughter who got her doctorate in psychiatric nursing. I have 2 sons with bachelors in psychology. My youngest son is a fireman and paramedic, and my youngest daughter works at a hospital with children with autism, and she's working to become a speech pathologist. So we saw all these kids going into healthcare and behavioral health, and we sat down and wanted to be a part of the solution and not, always the victims of that trauma. So we started a nonprofit called the Mental Health Support Network, and our program Our actual is domestic nonprofit that serves for free through educational programming, advocacy. I also serve as NAMI Gwinnett's advocacy chair. So I'm the one that periodically goes down to the state capitol to talk to legislators about the state of behavioral health in our state, which is horrible. We are at the bottom of the list when it comes to accessibility to healthcare, to behavioral health. We rank 48 out of 50 states. And I always like to, show how did we get to 48? We were 50 before COVID, and Alabama and Texas did worse than us, and that bumped us up. We didn't do a whole lot to raise up on that ranking. So serving in these spaces, with our nonprofit, I also serve as peer support in the only urgent psychiatric clinic in the state of Georgia. It's called Urgent Psych. This is an empath model that stands for Emergency Psychiatric Assessment, Treatment, and Healing. And this unique clinic also has connections to other healthcare systems where for people who need higher levels of care can actually go get extended care. But you can actually walk into this clinic and see a clinician in less than an hour and be out by 2 hours. And that is very unique and helps to, create accessibility to behavioral health in the state. I'm an educator, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a mental health advocate. And that's who I am as a person. Now, I am running for Georgia State Senate District 7. Woohoo! So excited. I'm so excited because this gives me now an avenue to do the work that we've been doing for quite some time at a higher level for better impacts within the state. It's one thing for us to do food drives and, help the homeless and make an impact on a couple dozen lives or a couple hundred lives per month. But working at that level, now we get to impact everyone in the state. Because in behavioral health right now, the state is struggling. In education, as an educator for over 30 years, we rank 36, I think it was, in the last ranking. We have not updated our QBE formula. We are not providing the funding that we should. We've lost our federal funding as well. So education in the state of Georgia is floundering, almost as bad as behavioral health is. And these are some of my legislative priorities, when I get into office, to address those things that impact working families the most. And that is healthcare accessibility, education, and the economy, stability in the economy in our district for working families, to make sure that we can have a day's work so that we can raise our kids, so that we can take care of our budgets and get the things that we need to have healthy families in this district. So I'm running for a number of reasons. A lot of people ask me, why am I running? We always give these stump speeches like I'm running because I've lived my life on the front lines of the issues that matter most to people in this district. I'm running because I was a little Black girl in Atlanta whose dad was no longer there. So that put us at the forefront of all these ACEs and disadvantages. And education was the key to my family breaking generational curses. So I want to make sure that I can help to fortify that avenue that pulled me from poverty and make sure that that works for other families and to close the gaps in where poverty exists. Families that can't afford health care, that can't afford affordable housing, that have food insecurity. When we start to close those gaps, families won't have to find ways out of poverty and breaking those curses like we did. Then those things become a little bit easier to raise a family in our area. So those are some of the reasons why I'm running. I've told you where I'm running, and I'm very excited about this space. Thank you.
Sigrid said, good night, everyone. We find ourselves, we were both sharing, we were listening in to our gubernatorial candidates. But we have been talking a lot about what's going in the world, and what's going on in the world, and what's going on in the nation, and what's going on in our state, and what's going on in our neighborhoods and families. The foundation of building, what do I want to say? Well, you look, I come on with the intro. Yes. The sound of America for progress has reached critical mass. Yes. I wrote that 10 years ago or more.
Nice. There's
The
still
sound of America for Progress has reached critical mass. So if that was real 10 years ago, oh my God, today,
yeah,
how do, this is a big deal for me, Astrid. How do we get better? How do we leave from a critical mass to even, we can't say flourish because we have to come to a survival point.
right, right. And it's funny that you mentioned that word survival. Those who are living in survival mode don't know they're in survival mode. They just don't know the things that they don't know. So they're constantly trying to make sure to make ends meet, to make sure that they can afford housing, that they can afford, food and economic stability, and doing that looks like families that flounder. As far as education, as far as behavioral health, and just the basics of things. We can't stop unringing that bell. We cannot make this not an emergency. There's no other approach to a burning fire than to rush in and put the fire out. So we have to continue to make sure that people understand the epidemic that we're in right now, because behavioral health is an epidemic in Georgia. 36 out of 50 states for education, we should be ringing the bell for that. Myself, having to step in, I used to be a homeschooling mom before I put my children into public schools. And I've also served children in the private school sector. And people are asking me, what does that mean? Do you favor private school over public school? It's like, no. It's funny because you guys can't see it, because there's always been this narrative that we're supposed to pick one or the other. Why not be a child advocate? Why not fund all the spaces where children learn? Why is that not the conversation? Because with families, it doesn't matter whether your child is in public school or private school. Families want to make ends meet. They want to make sure that their children gain the education that the state demands that they get, but they also want to grow up to be productive individuals who now can supersede their parents' efforts. You don't want to give birth to children who now struggle harder than you. You want them, and that's why I'm so proud of my kids. They leveled up for me and dad, so they did better than we were able to do. And that was the entire aim, is to make sure that they had resources and accessibilities that we didn't have. So we need to pay that forward for every family. It shouldn't be just a few families now who don't have to struggle, who don't. We were, for myself, as me and my husband working with 5 children, we still qualified for free and reduced lunch for our kids. So even though we had jobs and we ran businesses, it was still hard for families to make ends meet, at least for our family as well. So making sure that we ring that alarm and say, look, we need to get out of survival mode. We're so used to sitting in that pot boiling. We don't know what it's like to be on the other side of the kitchen, actually conducting the business on top of the stove, because we're in the pot boiling. And that survival mode has to be something that we let people know. Look, you shouldn't have to struggle that hard. You need resources. You need connections to things that make your life a little bit easier. So I don't think there's any way that we can get around, ringing that bell and showing the areas that we need that support in, because for us, we're too used to not having access, not knowing where resources are. And it was funny because you're talking about the gubernatorial debate. I just heard one of the candidates make a comment that was it was like, that was kind of weird. He made a comment, I'm here to solve your problems. I don't know if we need your help solving our problems. And a lot of us don't even know where our problems are. So if we have people outside of our own circles and communities saying that they need to solve our problems, we're in a bigger problem than we could have ever imagined. Because if you don't know what's going on in your house and an outsider says that I need to come and solve your problems, you got a bigger problem than you think. So that alarm needs to be constantly rung. We need to go door to door telling people what these issues are. Your life can be better. This can happen. We're complacent in survival mode. So it's important that we ring that bell as often and as loud as possible.
I think some of what happened was we were at a point, even let me say, even at the COVID time, we were at a point where we had begun to build ourselves and build a strong foundation for ourselves. And it was knocked down with COVID. And then we started building up again, and it was knocked down, and it was knocked down. Different things prohibit us from growing. And we ended up thinking what we had would bring us to one level, but it kept us from just falling out.
Right. Right. So my thing was a couple of stimulus checks is not going to take us out of generations of poverty. So, the little bit that we did get from our own tax investments into the state was still not enough for a lot of families. Still you had families who had to move around because the housing affordability was is getting ridiculous even back then during the COVID years. Families who had to prioritize eating and having a place to stay, but not healthcare. Working in the clinic let us know that behavioral health is still something of a luxury and not a right for each individual. You have families that still don't have insurance, that have not met their deductible, that even if they don't have insurance, don't have the amount of money to pay for out-of-pocket expenses. So, living in survival mode means that you sacrifice a lot that some people have, as a luxury. So we need to make sure that we're saying that, and we're saying it loud, and that people realize that there is something that you can get that will give you some relief. And if people are not fighting for that, then we're complacent with survival mode.
And one thing I hope people would understand, the stimulus check had nothing to do but with you and what you needed.
Right.
That was to stimulate the economy of the nation. It didn't do anything for you. One thing they knew was they don't know finances. And I'm talking about us as a people. They don't know finances. They're going to run out and spend every dime. Right. And that's what they wanted it to look like. Something good was happening with the economy, but it wasn't.
Well, the stimulus
it took our money and threw it, and threw it at us, and because they knew we would throw it right back at them. I'm sorry.
Right. And that's true. And really, what it did as well, because we had paused, employments closed, jobs closed, people were at a deficit. So the stimulus check was really anarchy control. We don't need people, in the streets doing whatever, because now they can't. This U.S. experiment now has failed. So that was just enough to control the masses, because a lot of families, including ours, my husband's a barber. There were weeks where he didn't work. So a stimulus check was just enough. And thank God that a lot of these organizations and businesses paused the utility bills and were very, very lenient when it came to that, or we would not have survived that. So a stimulus check wasn't what it was narrated to be. It was something that could have been reproduced 10 times over and still not fill the gap of where we were from the beginning of COVID. So, we'll make the narrative exactly what it is. People like to spin narratives in ways that make them look good. But a stimulus check that was my money anyway. So.
Right. And that's one thing. Bringing that up brings me to where we need to be with the understanding dollars, understanding finances, also with understanding mental health. We still have that, oh no, I don't want no mental health. No, no. But most of us, like I was talking to you the other day, sitting in the jail on any given day, at least 1/3 of the people that's coming to jail have to be redirected to mental health. And this is not just counseling, where if you had an issue and you got counseling, it could help redirect your life. This is where you may need some medicine. You just can't cope with the simple things of life. Right. And so if we could get rid of the stigma and reach out for help. Can you talk about that some, please?
Oh, yeah, I do more than talk about it. I wrote a book about it. I have a book on Amazon called Crazy. And that book deals just with that. It deals with the stigma of mental health, why a lot of families of disenfranchised communities, those who struggle the most, I was told to pick a struggle. I'm Black, I'm a woman, who wanted me to be the suicide girl? Pick a struggle, go get educated and rise up above it. But guess what? Trauma follows us. So being able to have the conversations is one of the reasons why we started our mental health nonprofit. And this is one of the things that I put even in my mission statement. We are going and we're looking to popularize, normalize, and glamorize. And I take that as, and I'm going to trademark before people steal it, P&G. Popularize, normalize, and glamorize mental health and wellness for everyone. And that's important to understand. We use this term mental health, which in the clinical sense is behavioral health, but we never attach, because behavioral health can be horrible. We see that every day in the clinic. We see that in the hospitals. Our behavioral health, and with most of us following COVID and dealing with trauma and all the things that have come behind us, most of us are still struggling in our behavioral health. But we never think about the wellness aspect. What does it mean to have good behavioral health? What does it mean to have safe spaces to have conversations about behavioral health? What does it mean to remove that stigma? Because every community has a stigma. Now, I'll say that because I think I'm an expert when it comes to cultures. For the past, I'm a Black girl from Atlanta, but I have been serving different communities for the close to 30 years. And I can tell you the stigmas in the Iraqi community. I can tell you the mental health stigmas in the Pakistani community. I can tell you in the Iranian community. I can tell you in the Afghani community. I can tell you in the Ghanaian community. I can tell you. So every community has something, some barrier that we have either in our culture, negative in our culture, that makes us feel like, for me as a Black woman, Black people don't go to therapy. That's a stigma. That's a barrier to accessibility. That's one of those things where we're just going to take it as a negative and we're just going to run with it and accept it as a norm. So stigmas have to be fought. And every community needs to stand up and find out where that stigma is. In the clinic, I was just talking to someone in our community that's from the Pakistani community. And they were like, you cannot let people know you're going to the hospital for behavioral health. They look at that and look down on people and look at them as if, they've been cursed or something is negative attached to their family. That's a huge stigma to break past if you have a behavioral health diagnosis to go get help. You got to jump over that. And we all have our own implicit biases and our own stigmas to ourselves. And I see that as a peer. When I work in the clinic and a patient comes in to see a clinician, they also come and talk to me as a peer with lived experience. And then we talk about everything else outside of the clinical conversation. I talk about, what your support system looks like. How is your diet? Are you sleeping? When I talk to people about everything else outside of their diagnosis and medicine, then you see where these stigmas exist. They were like, yeah, I didn't really want to come in. I tried to commit suicide this morning and, my husband told me that I needed to come in. And, so the stigma is, we don't realize how deep and embedded those stigmas are that create those barriers to care, even amongst ourselves. So we need to start creating, and this is part of the mission of our nonprofit, is to create safe spaces. I wrote that book and a few others. I have some children's books that are mental health themed to teach children now stigma-free language of how to talk about how they feel, how to live with their emotions. We don't tell people how to feel. We tell them now how to process their feelings into behaviors, and that's what behavioral health is. So, giving people safe spaces to talk, learning the vocabulary for being able to say that something is wrong. That's another problem. We get to the doctor and we still don't want to talk, or we don't know what to say. I had a woman that came into the clinic and she sat in that waiting room 20 minutes arguing, I don't need therapy. I just need someone to talk to. I don't want therapy. I don't want a counselor. I just want help. So getting even the language of knowing, what am I supposed to say when I finally get myself to the help? Bringing a horse to water is one thing, but if the horse don't know how to drink, it could die right there on the side of the pond, die of thirst. So it's a lot that we need to do in our own communities. We don't need anybody showing up for us. We need to learn these tools so that we can do it ourselves. And it starts with the individual into their families and broadens outward.
And talking it through can make such a difference. I had a lady today that came in and she said, Oh, they just brought me in here. Look, that old officer, she was all upset just because I was acting belligerent in the office, blah, 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 blah. But my son, blah, 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 blah. I said, but look, you can't go to schools acting like that anymore. So much is happening in schools. And unfortunately, and for us, and I relate to it as a black woman. So I said us as black women. I don't have the experience you have. Our
I'm still a
emotions,
black woman in all these spaces.
but you
I'm
may
still that black
know
woman.
other people who deal with this.
Right.
I said sometimes we're going through so much. Our emotions are the last part of us that we discipline
Yes.
because it's such a release of everything else we grow. But we must learn how to discipline our emotions.
Yes.
And she and I had a little talk because I had a moment. It was at the end of my day. And I think that helped her to understand. This lady had a master's degree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see PhDs come through and they're in
Yeah.
crisis. You see doctors, dentists, psychiatrists who have psychiatrists. So, if you have a brain, you're not exempt from needing mental health and wellness. It doesn't matter about your
Sometimes
race, your
you just have
ethnicity,
to look
or
at
your
yourself. I'm sorry. Sometimes you just have to. Counseling is good to help you look at yourself to see where I can do this better. Because most people, they're going to blame the whole world about everything and not look to see um, what they could do better.
right.
Another thing I want to talk about before I get back to the main thing I wanted to talk about is how children are fighting their parents and sending them to jail. Where have we lost that? What in the world? I see that more and more and more. Children will fight their parents, and then the parents have to come to jail. Now,
Well, that goes back to, that's a big issue because I'm 55, I'll be 56 this year. There are things that we didn't do with adults back in the day, so to speak. So even, with us raising our kids, we had different methodologies, how we're going to raise our kids. I'm from the old school black community where we didn't test our elders. I wouldn't, out of love and respect and fear for my grandparents, for my mother, for my aunties, I wouldn't step over that line. I've never raised my voice at my elders before, just out of fear and love, and nowadays, it's a little bit different. Even for the kids that, I have raised, they have more of a voice than I ever had. So that has to always be tempered with, yes, you want to now give your kids a voice and give them collaboration, but a parent is a parent. As an educator for the past 30 years, kids don't have the brain capacity to make certain decisions, and parents need to make sure we can give birth to our friends, and like I said, I ain't your little friend, but I need to be strong enough to make the decisions and say the things that are necessary to keep you safe, to help raise you to a functioning and productive adult. And again, that just shows that what we're looking at right now, because we're coming from broken families. And these broken families are now using their trauma, using their lack of parenting skills now to raise a whole generation of children now who have more disciplinary records than I've ever seen in schools ever before. It used to be where you could never see people get called to the office or get expelled or suspended. That is a norm now. These kids are acting out, in the schools. They are telling their parents what they will and will not do. And it is becoming an issue that stems from parenting or
and
lack thereof.
and I can see it because when people will come into when I did mental health crisis and when I do corrections,
Mhm.
these grown people, sometimes I just sit back and say, Lord, what is wrong with our people?
Well,
Not that
our
I'm
people
the
are
only
victims. We're
ones, but
victims.
I'm
Yeah.
not saying I don't care about other people. But I don't want to fix somebody else before I fix mine, and I don't have to explain that.
Right.
But I would really like to see, like one guy, he said He acting the fool, always having to be in lockdown. I said, don't you know the judge is going to see every time? This was a while ago at another jail. That the judge is going to see every time you had to come be locked down. He going to see you move. And then he said, oh, the judge, you know, I got mental. I said, the judge, you know the difference between mental and you just acting up. He knows the difference between mental and behavior. And every time you had to move because you were doing something that your mental health did not cause you, if you're not in crisis, why are you acting up?
Right. Right. Right.
And so much like we were talking about the other night, so much has become normal that's not normal to us.
Right. Right.
How, and I know this is a big question, how do we get our society to understand that? What is the norm? What is normal?
Well,
Because
that's
this crazy
that's
stuff ain't.
right. That's a big question because I don't, as an educator, I don't like the word norm, because we use it a lot. We use it a lot. We use norm referencing. We use what's normal in the classroom. We use what's normal when it comes to data and assessments. We use that, but on 8 billion people, what would we consider normal? Or what would we consider abnormal? And that's basically things that we can look at that function. So things that don't function, we would look at them as abnormal. But like you just said about parenting, if now the norm is a lack of parenting, then we need to get back to the conversation about functionality. So if it's working, because if you're able to do the things you need to do, kids are able to navigate that space, parents are able to do what they need to do, then things may become a new norm. But if it's not, if it's dysfunctional, sometimes dysfunction is the norm. And that's what we're seeing a lot of, especially in our communities. We're seeing the dysfunction being the norm. But guess what? That's also tied to you. It's also tied to economic data. So if you have families that are constantly in survival mode, that are not making their ends meet, dysfunction is the rule of the day. If you don't know where your food is going to come from, it's going to be abnormal. If you don't know if you're moving house to house or living out of a hotel, if you only have one parent, if your parents are dealing with drug abuse, all those adverse childhood experiences, if you're living in those populations, then that is normal. That is normal. I didn't know being poor and unhoused was not the norm because it was normal for us. It was normal for us not to have what we needed. So we need to start talking about functionality. And even in all of these areas where we see these problems, and it as a nurse, it all goes back to behavioral health. When it comes to the criminal justice system, even during COVID, I reached out to our local sheriff and talked to him about, what does Gwinnett County's behavioral health footprint look like? Because we saw that he had just created a mental health task force. So, he informed us that, about 25 to 30% of all of their 911 calls are behavioral health related. But guess what? The systems are still broken. We passed a law, a state law, put into law, HB 1013, which became the mental health parity bill. Part of that bill spoke towards if someone was in a behavioral health crisis and they were committing a misdemeanor and were arrested, that they would be redirected to a medical response and not a criminal response, depending on the type of activity that was going on. So we need to identify where those gaps are, where those things that are not working, and come up with solutions. But we got to talk about what's working and what's not working, because dysfunction can be the norm. And we can just all get to the point, because 2020 was abnormal and we all lived through the abnormal, So now looking through that as trauma informed people, we have to look now, what we used to say, getting back to normal, getting back to what we had before. But sometimes we can't, so it creates a new norm.
And I have to say, in outer communities, there was I worked in Noonan County when I was working in the crisis unit, where police would bring people in crisis to that unit and not bring them to jail.
Right.
In some jails that were not so close or not in that county would still redirect their patients, but they were jails that were out. It wasn't like it was Atlanta or Decatur. So I did see it happening And I was happy to see it happening because then you're not being criminalized because of your mental health condition.
Exactly. 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 And I've had a personal experience. My brother um, just passed away August 5th of 2025. Um, Living in a family where we struggle, like a lot of Black families did struggle. My brother was involved in a car accident about 10 years ago and got addicted to opioids, as the opioid crisis has taken a lot of Americans. And in that, he spent the last few years of his life unhoused and in and out of criminal justice because he was unhoused and dealing with substance abuse. So he was never able to get the support that he needed. And just about every one of his crises was met with a criminal response. You know, we call Georgia Crisis Line, we call 988 to get help. But again, if you're living as second class citizens, you know, below that poverty line, you know, access to care is always so far outside of our reach. And I remember the last crisis that we dealt with him was actually on my mom's birthday. This was kind of the last crisis before we found out he had glioblastoma, brain cancer. And he was in crisis that day, and it took us about 40 hours to get him into somewhere to get support. He was turned away from so many different health systems. We had crisis come out. They're like, you're going to have to take him to the ER on your own. We went to DeKalb Medical. We went to Emory. We went to all these places until we got to Grady. And then he got the 1013 script right. Because if you don't say the words correctly in the state, even though you do have a pathway to involuntary hold for medical responses of crisis, if you don't say the script right, you're not getting in.
Right, exactly.
We're still turning people away, and it took us 40 hours to get him into support while he was in that medical crisis. You know, so you can try, you know, but if these systems are not, if there's not a spotlight put on them, and we don't know how they work, and they're just broken, and we're just hitting that brick wall every single time, we're not going to make a dent in this behavioral health crisis that we're in the state of Georgia.
Okay, so I want to come down to what I think people really need help in understanding, and that is I met you, educator, mental health, family, and now politics.
Yeah.
And I think if we talk about that connection, people would understand why politics and local politics
Right.
is really the foundation of us getting over some of the boundaries that is set for us in life. Can we talk about that? How did we come to that day, and how it all works out for us, and why we need to be involved?
Right. It's funny because until I was recruited in 2024 in December by Emerge Georgia, which is a program that was created by Vice President Kamala Harris to recruit minority women to run for office. That January, I started that program. Unfortunately, that January, my brother was diagnosed with glioblastoma, and it was a hard program for me to get through because I went through in January through May, and my brother passed in August. So, you know, going through that program, I was learning about these systems that we were existing in, these broken systems. Having a brother who had insurance, but wasn't enough to handle brain cancer. Having to put him in the Grady Health System, going back and forth downtown from Gwinnett County, you know, having to now exhaust all of the health insurance and now look for, you know, indigent care to deal with chemo and radiation therapy, having to look for hospice, all of those things. Politics is everywhere. And I didn't realize it until, you know, getting into that space and learning now how to look at these broken systems through a legislative eye, and that all of these things are controlled from the top down. You know, we're just used to being in these systems and used to dealing with the fact that they're ineffective, broken, or don't exist, you know, as accessibility for us as well. So what I found out is politics is everywhere, from how you have children to how you pay for your health care, from the time you get up in the morning to the time you drive down the street, how your house is built is zoning as politics, how the streets are run and street, everything is politics. So once I graduated from that program, it was like, it felt like Neo in the Matrix. It was like, oh my God, I see the codes. I can actually see that everything is politics. There's politics in the school. Everything we do in the school environment is dictated mostly by legislation. Raising children, your children don't belong to you. If you make a misstep as a parent, the state of Georgia can come in and swoop and take your kids. You need to know that. Parenting is politics. So we need to have these conversations where we're not used to seeing now that this administration just pulled the curtain back on Oz and we just saw the man behind the curtain. Everybody needs to be aware of what does politics look like, because everything we do every day is dictated from the top down. So nothing in my motherhood, business, education, or mental health is free from the control and dictation of legislation and politics.
And why should we be involved in it? More of us than not say, oh, I don't have nothing to do with politics.
Mm-hmm. Which I check people who say that. You mean to say, and this is what I tell my middle schoolers, be the boss of you. Because if you're not the boss of you, somebody else is the boss of you. So if you're not voting, if you're not a part of this civic engagement, it will still happen sans you, without you. So people will make decisions about your life without your voice. Things will happen without your input. So you can sit out and then sit back and say, oh, look at what the government's doing, and the government is like that because you didn't have a voice. Your vote wasn't included, and the more of us that we can garner that support together, that becomes a powerful entity in the spaces that we need to have a voice. I'll use this example, unions, teachers unions, things where people kind of garner together their voice and their power to make an impact in the spaces where it needs to be held. So, my thing is there's no such thing as I'm not political. You're just sitting out the process and let somebody else to be the boss of you.
Oh, wow. That's good. That's good. I'm sorry. Now I want to talk about just a little bit about the war that's not a war that's going on, but it's a war. They're talking about the draft coming back. I'm just looking at how all of these people's home, the area where they live, is just bombed up. Who's to keep those people from bombing us up? So I'm thinking, how do we activate the dead parts of us, which is the people that live in a community who will complain about the judge, but you don't even know who's the magistrate judge, because you didn't even vote for that. You don't go out for that election. You have left the foundation of your life, of what puts your life together, the politics that put your life together. We don't pay any attention to that. And then we have this person up here, because we have all of these people down here who's supposed to be our connection that makes sure we have a voice and we're seeing up there. So now we find ourselves. And so tell me, as part of the solution, if we could talk about, because I know that you're planning on being a great part of the solution where you're running. But everybody that listens, we have people in Texas and different states. So that listens to Vivacious Speak. So what do we need to do to wake up in our communities, like you awakening other people, because you're waking up other people, and even waking up a part of me, even though I know I vote, I study my candidates, but I'm not active out there. But, oh, wait, Astrid running, what I have to do, I have to get out there and I have to do something. So can we talk about that?
Yeah, complacency is dangerous. We need to realize, number one, that we have an individual. Won't call him human because I don't see the human parts of him in this administration, that has found a loophole in our Constitution and is weaponizing it against the citizens. So, for those of us that have sat on the sidelines, who have not voted, who have not gotten engaged in the civic engagement part of it, you don't protest, you don't have a voice, you just go on your merry way. Unfortunately, those people will be reactionary when the ish hits the fan, so to speak. So when it's knocking on your doorstep, is when a lot of people will get active. But I will say this, be a student of scholarship, do your own studies. From what I know about what's going on right now in this administration and what's happening, our tax dollars were just used to bomb a country at the behest of another country. I don't know if the definition of treason is changing or unpatriotic is a different definition now, but for us to be Israel first doesn't seem like America first anymore. So, I'm being facetious, but I'm like, Iran hasn't bombed a country in over 200 years. They have not gotten into a conflict. And in 1979, they actually let black hostages go. So they don't seem like an enemy to me, but I bet my dad said that too when it came to Vietnam. Just as Cassius Clay said, ain't no Viet Cong ever did nothing to me, so I won't fight your war. So there's a lot of, things that we need to take into account because right now I'd rather have healthcare than bombing a country that has done nothing to me. I would rather have public schools that are fully funded. I would rather have economic stability in our communities, because we got the money. Even in the state, we had money to fill the gap in mental health, but our governor sat on it. He sat on that money. We had a surplus since COVID. We got money. So it's never a thing that we don't have it. It's just not being used for us. We're not that important. And that's for those people who are sitting on your hands because you don't get involved in the process. You don't show up. You don't get a say in it. So all those resources get diverted back to the people who show up, the people who have a voice. And most times it's not our community. So there is something that needs to happen to jolt us back into civic engagement, because that's what I remember from my grandparents. I remember people who are involved in their communities, in their churches, in their neighborhoods. My grandmother was the Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock eulogized my grandmother, who was a 40-year member of Ebenezer Baptist Church. So we seen the struggle. We saw Black people get engaged and involved. We're very complacent now. Not to say that the last couple of years we have not seen people on the streets who have gone out for things like police brutality, about voting rights and those sort of things, but it's not enough. We, the people, are massive. We need whatever it does to take to, jolt us into activity before we're forced to be active, which means things like maybe drafting our children later on this year. I heard that, that may be a consideration of getting our young people who are 18 to 30 years old drafted for a war that we don't want to be involved in. So we need to wake up before we have to wake up. We need to get engaged and involved because other people are the boss of us and controlling our lives and we don't have a say so. We need to get away from the complacency of non-activity because Black folks, we've been active. We built this country. We helped to change the trajectory of this country just off of the humanity of demanding what was our right as humans. Now this is a second wave. And I think that if we don't, we're going to be erased. This whole thing of, getting back to making America great again is code for let's put everybody outside of us back to second-class citizenship. So, there's a lot that we need to do before you end up a second-class citizen again, and I have my mother who's in her 70s. Yeah, they remember that. My aunts, my great aunt is still alive. She's in her 80s. When you hear the stories of how they grew up, there's a disgust of, way Black people were treated, people of color. If we don't listen to these stories, we're going to be right back where we started from, probably worse.
Yeah, I remember. I remember the marches. I still march whenever they have marches. I am out there because that was the power that released us from slavery. That was the power that released us. And then when we got so far, we thought we had arrived and we backed up. When I think of my city where I was raised, we had a strong voice in what happened in that city. And when I look at the city now, I say, what happened to our city? Where is the voice of the people in this city? Where is it? I'm totally like for the election, I was just totally distraught
Right.
that the city was sat here without a voice. And how did we give it back to the people who we had to fight to get it away from and bring it back to our own hands? Now, where's our city?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because the city virtually or theoretically exists in Black Panther. There was something revolutionary about that movie, about
Mm-hmm.
Afrofuturism, about showing us at the narrative of power and strength, about us having our own nation with resources that were unlimited and untouched. Even though that was a fictional movie, that's something that woke Black people up because we showed up. We showed up in character too to go see that movie. And we
Yeah,
saw it multiple times because it sparked something in us that we didn't know was there. There were ideas of what we could be, the strength, the beauty, the humanity, because Wakanda didn't bother nobody. They didn't bother nobody unless somebody came for them. So we need to get back to that idea of what could we be at our greatest. And it's not just isolated for Black people. Everybody has the right. Black, brown,
right, right.
everybody has that right. But I'm gonna be honest, if everyone had listened to Black people from the beginning, we wouldn't be in this predicament because we've been ringing the bell for a couple of 100 years now, and people are
Mhm.
just now saying, "Oh my God, look what's happening!" Yeah, we've been saying it for a long time. So when it comes to freedom, none of us are free until all of us are free, and until America do right by Black folks, they ain't gonna do right. They're
And you
not.
know what? When we demand,
Hmm.
I asked a young guy, because I always want to talk to people on the other side of my desk at work. I say, how did it become so easy for us to call each other out of our names and our men to call us bees and for us to curse our parents out and fight? When did it? He said, I don't know. I guess it came from slavery. I said, that's a lie. I said, that's a lie. That did not come from slavery. In my day, we wouldn't think of answering or fighting, or raise our hands or our voice. My daddy hit me one time because he said, I can see what you're thinking. Our neighborhoods, what we owned our neighborhoods because all of the businesses were owned by Black people
Right.
in our community, and our money took care of each other.
Hmm. Hmm.
We had to walk down to George to get to the Black store because we didn't go to Dolisa around the corner. We
Yep.
passed Dolisa up. So, we have to begin to love one another. That didn't come from slavery.
That
Because
came from the pathology of trauma and evil. If you study the pathology of slavery, you'll see where we still pull these elements of not loving ourselves, not seeing our skin as beautiful, not seeing us as intelligent, not seeing us as deserving of leadership and power. If we can't see it in ourselves, others are not going to be able to see it. So when we try to figure out where it came from, we know where it came from. The question is, like I said, for mental health, where's the wellness? We're missing that wellness. What does it mean to live well? What does it mean to have good behavioral health? What does it mean now to have strong families? What does it mean now to have the strength that we didn't see? And I'm hoping that we get back to that part and we activate the part of us that needs to wake up and get active before we have to wake up and get active.
what
So we
I remember, and often when I'm going home, I go through a coming back. My trip home to Louisiana, I stop in Africa Town. Africa Town, and then I guess if I look at it like this, Africa Town, you remember when the last ship that came in with slaves, it was illegal, so they dumped these people off the boat,
Yep.
and they still tried to enslave them. The people said, send us back. They saved up their money and said, send us back. And they said, no, we're not sending you back. So they built a whole town. And it's still original African people, some of the lineage of the people that's there. You know, you can go and meet their family members. And they built a whole town. Like the Lower Ninth Ward was educated people, people who raised families, owned their own homes. And this was in the 1960s, 70s. You know, later it became as we grew up and moved up and moved the money out and allowed other people to come in and take over the businesses. Then we didn't then you know, we lost the power of our neighborhood.
Right.
So
Right.
we had our own St. David, we had our own credit union. You know, all the children we had, they taught us how to have our savings account at the credit union. I remember when I started working in high school, my aunt took me down to open a bank account at Hibernia Bank. And we have to come back to these things.
Yes. Yes.
We have to come back to these things, taking care of ourselves.
Yep. Going back to healthcare, financial literacy, ethnic pride. You know, people are still in this thing of, you know, why y'all still fighting? Because y'all there, y'all made it. When I look back at families and I make a comparison, we're still dealing with the generational curses. You know, we still lead when it comes to lack of accessibility to healthcare. We're still at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to economic development. Black and brown people are still struggling. So it may seem that we made a leg up, but there's no equity and equality for all of us, you know, and I don't want just a little bit of bread and circuses to keep me quiet for a couple of generations. I want what I came here for. And that is what I see everybody else having access to be able to raise a family without struggling, being able to have those things that are currently a luxury be a right for us, and to be able to speak towards what others need so that we can take care of each other. So that's imperative.
I'm so glad that you're here tonight. Can you leave us with something that will help us build strong and hear where we should hear and move and do in politics? Could you help us, please?
Absolutely. And I'm going to use this dirty 4-letter word, woke. Y'all need to wake up. Y'all need to wake up. They use this as a dirty word. Woke is not a dirty word. Wake up to who's running your government. Wake up to who's the boss of you. Wake up, since you're not using your vote and your voice, to who is controlling your life without your say so. So woke is the 4-letter word from the principal, the early childhood educator, WOKE. Wake up. May 19th is a primary in Gwinnett County for our Senate district race. There are plenty of other races that will also primary on that day. So in the next 69 days, as of today, we got about 69 days until the primary. We need you to wake up. We need you to get on some of these websites and figure out who's running, who's going to be representing in these spaces, and vote them in, because these are your fighters. You know, I just got into the ring and I became a fighter. You know, I have a wonderful coach, but I'm a fighter. I'm in the ring and I'm ready to fight for those people because people fought for me. In order for me to get to the space where I am, we had to claw and fight and educate and hold it down and, you know, do the most so that we can get here. And now I'm ready to do that. I've raised my kids. I've got grandkids. I got tons of energy left, and now I'm ready to fight for you. So I need you guys to wake up, you know, put us where we need to be, because whether you want to fight or not, I'm going to do the fighting for you.
Thank you so much. And one more thing I need you to do is, could you say the name of your books that people, especially the ones for children, that people can find on Amazon?
Yes, you can actually search my name, put my name into the search bar, Astrid, Astrid, last name Ross, Ross. I currently have 5 books on Amazon. 3 of them are geared towards early childhood for children. They're picture books that talk about emotions, Rainbow in the Clouds, Zamina's Anxiety About Ramadan, and Ahmed's Calm Cloud. I also wrote a book about, and this is geared towards high schoolers, and they have lesson plans to go with them, and it's called Escape Velocity. And my last book is Crazy. Crazy is that's for grown folks. This is our conversation about the stigma of behavioral health nationwide. So put my name in the search bar, Astrid Ross, and all of my books will come up. There's even, you can even download the books as well.
And remember to go out and vote, Astrid Ross.
Astrid for Georgia. Astrid, the number 4, Georgia spelled out. AstridForGeorgia.org. And I'm running for Georgia Senate District 7.
And read all about her and look for some of those qualities in the people that's running in your district, in your city, in your state. Know your judge, know your sheriff, because that's who our children are going to be running into, and that's who we run into.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.